Hello, and thank you for joining our webinar today, and apologies for the slight delay. My name is Andrew Mills, and I am a research scientist here at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Today we'll be presenting on recently completed research titled Impacts of High Variable Renewable Energy Futures on Wholesale Electricity Prices and on Electric Sector Decision Making. The primary authors of this report are Yo Seal, who will be leading the presentation today, myself, and Ryan Weiser. We also want to acknowledge our colleagues from LCG Consulting who conducted the modeling work that will be presented today. We also benefited throughout this project from time and feedback of a technical review committee. This work was funded by the U.S. Department of Energy Strategic Priorities and Impact Analysis team within the Office of Electricity, Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. Before we get started with the presentation, I'll cover just a few of the logistics. This webinar will be in listen-only mode, but we do plan to leave time to answer questions at the end. So please use the chat box on the bottom left of your screen to enter questions at any time during the presentation. We'll get to as many of those questions as we can, and we'll follow up with you directly if we're not able to get to a question. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the website shown at the bottom of this slide. And there you'll also find a copy of the slide deck, the full report, and the underlying data from our different scenarios. With that, I'd like it to now turn it over to Yo.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew, for this introduction and for your leadership of this project. I first would like to start with providing a brief overview of the general research project. And so, in general, we know that wind and solar are what we will call variable renewable energy, or VRE. So in general, we know that VRE can affect wholesale electricity price patterns and actually make them meaningfully different from today's price patterns or the conventional price patterns that many of us have been familiar with within the industry. And we also know that many long-lasting decisions for infrastructure investments into the electric sector are still based on historical observations or often assume a business-as-usual future that only features fairly low shares of wind and solar and do not fully reflect the price effects of wind and solar. The motivating question for this research project was whether certain long-lasting electric sector decisions that are still made based on those conventional assumptions that reflect relatively low levels of wind and solar will still achieve their intended objective in a future that actually features much more wind and solar. And over the course of this presentation, we will describe various decisions and how those decisions may change with higher shares of wind and solar. We will present insights from a detailed electricity market simulation that featured a capacity expansion model and a unit commitment model for multiple regions in the United States for a low and a high wind and solar future. And while we only highlight qualitatively in this presentation and in the report the possible impacts of the VRE-induced price patterns on demand and supply side decisions, future work will utilize these electricity market prices that we've derived here and will serve as a foundation for later planned quantitative evaluations of these decisions in a low and high VRE future. So over here on this slide, we really have all the key findings of our research project, and don't be afraid, we'll go back to each of these little pieces of information over the course of the report and explain in more detail what they actually mean. But in general, you'll see here that we have wind and solar penetrations of 40 to 50%. We have a low VRE future that has the 2016 wind and solar shares, so kind of today's VRE penetration. And we contrast that then with a high wind, a high solar, and a balanced future. And we looked at 4 different regions: the Southwest Power Pool, New York, California, and Texas. We found that in general, average prices have gone lower. We found that more hours have very low prices, less than $5 a megawatt hour, up to nearly 20% in one scenario in Texas. We found changes in the diurnal price profile. We found in general more variability in prices. We found higher prices for ancillary services, and here's the example of regulation down product. And we found a general change in the timing of when the top net load hours occur, so the peak hours of demand after accounting for wind and solar, and those really shifting more and more into the early evening. So we'll get back to this over the course of the presentation, but just as a little executive summary here. In terms of the structure of today's presentation, at first I would like to give a brief background, some evidence of VRE-induced price changes that we already observe in the markets today, and a little bit of theory. Then I'll like to explain again our research motivation and objective with a little bit more detail and provide a couple of examples of such long-lasting electric sector decisions and how they may change. I will then present the analytical framework that we used to have a quantitative assessment of electricity price changes, and then really dive into the heart of the presentation, our key findings of how wholesale prices change at higher VRE penetrations. At last, we'll conclude with a brief discussion of our findings and an outlook for future research. So at first, some evidence of the VRE-induced price changes so far and the theory behind it. I'll try to keep this relatively short because I think many of you are familiar and we're running a little short of time. So in general, there has been an extensive global and American literature that demonstrates the general tendencies of what happens once you introduce wind and solar to an electricity market. The exact effects are quite dependent on how that particular electric system is structured and what the generator portfolio looks like and what the overall flexibility is within that system. There are a couple of characteristics that are quite different for wind and solar in comparison to conventional generators. That is in particular the variability and uncertainty of electricity output. It is quite dependent on the locational resource regime, and it has very low marginal costs. For wind and solar, most of the costs are captured in the upfront capital cost and less so in the ongoing maintenance cost or operational costs. And that is quite different from many other resources in the electricity mix and effects of how they bid into the electricity market. As a consequence of more wind and solar, we often see that total capacity within our system increases. Also increases is the need of reserves, ancillary services, and ramping capacity. Baseload units often operate less, and as a consequence of that, low capital cost technologies, for example, combustion turbines, are in general more favored in such market environment in comparison to low upfront cost but high operational cost units, such as, for example, a nuclear unit or a coal or combined cycle gas unit. Overall, it favors increasing supply of flexibility by other generating units, demand, or even storage, and it highlights the benefit of increased transmission that can bridge one resource area to another load center or address local congestion. In terms of prices, we see that as a consequence of these different electricity market structures and VRE characteristics, we see altered temporal patterns of prices, more volatility in prices, and sometimes even negative prices. We see different geographic patterns of prices and, at least in the short term, a suppression of average price levels. Over the medium term, that may change a little bit in the ease as some generators retires and others come in. Overall, though, it is thought that more revenue may come from the ancillary service market, capacity payments, or particular scarcity events when one is pushing the boundaries of the system and electricity prices really go high. Some policy incentives may magnify these effects. For example, the production tax credit for wind resources in the United States incentivizes wind owners to actually bid negative prices into the electricity markets of up to $21 per megawatt hour, and so that may magnify some of the effects. On the right side are a couple of examples where we see electricity price patterns change quite a bit. In Australia, peak electricity prices during the middle of the day could be observed in 2009 and 2010, really vanished after some PV was added by 2012. Similarly, in Germany, the price curve flattened significantly with the addition of solar up until the year 2012. And in California, many of you may be familiar with the duck curve, which usually refers to net load levels And in the year 2017, we already saw this duck curve now show up in electricity prices as well. In terms of theory, I'll keep this relatively short again. On a very simplified conceptual basis here, we have different generating units that are often ordered based on their marginal cost, and so that then leads to this fairly steady supply curve with combustion turbines that have very high operational cost but low capital cost on the very right side, and hydro or nuclear on the left side. And the price in this conventional environment is really set by variable demand levels. So the demand curve intersects at different places of this fairly steady supply curve, and that leads then to price variation over the course of the day and the year. Once we add renewables in, because of the low marginal cost, they're added on the left side of the supply stack and really shift out the supply curve to the right, which then leads to different points of intersections between the demand and the supply curve. And within a given hour, when wind and solar is there at the same demand level, prices would then decrease from the P no VRE to P with VRE. So the important takeaway here is that in any given hour, prices are now not just set just by varying demand, but also by varying wind and solar generation. Over the medium term, as I highlighted earlier already, the supply curve may actually change, and as a consequence of that, the slope may change as some units retire and other units come into the market. At last, this changing pricing environment also highlights opportunities of increased demand flexibility. So if demand would actually be a little bit more elastic and would be able to respond to changing pricing levels, this would offer an opportunity to mitigate some very high price peaks and actually reduce demand during those times, and in turn increase demand in price periods when electricity prices are very low. So with this very brief introduction, I'd like to now move on to our research motivation and some examples of electric sector decisions making. So again, our question was, will long-lasting electric sector decisions that are based on past assumptions that reflect low wind and solar levels still achieve their intended objective in a future market that reflects higher levels of wind and solar? We have a couple of example decisions on the demand side on the left and supply side on the right. We describe those decisions in a little bit more detail in the actual written report, so please turn to that, and also features a table that describes the decisions with a little bit more detail there. But I'll just highlight a few. For example, energy efficiency portfolios. Historically, people have just used average electricity prices for evaluating the cost benefits of energy efficiency portfolios. But there's an increasing trend to really incorporate time of use or time-dependent valuation that looks at hourly electricity prices and actually do forward-looking scenario analyses as well for accounting for different futures, maybe also one that includes more wind and solar. In a traditional environment with low levels of wind and solar, one really saw the peak demand and also peak prices during the middle of the day. And so any kind of efficiency measure that was able to reduce load during those times was thought to be very cost effective. So for example, one may wanted to target air conditioning units for residential houses to reduce load during the middle of the day. However, for example, in a high solar future, we may have a lot of excess electricity in the middle of the day, so becoming more energy efficient may not necessarily pay off in the same way as it used to do. Instead, we may want to focus on energy savings at the end of the day, so focus instead on efficiency measures of residential lighting or maybe even street lighting. Similarly, electrification of gas end uses is a hot topic that many people talk about. There is an example of residential hot water heaters, and heat pumps, for example, could provide a big benefit there in the future. But some of their cost-benefit evaluations may change or depend quite a bit on wholesale electricity prices or price patterns. So this is an area that we intend to look at. Another example is electric vehicle charging infrastructure. California, for example, the investor-owned utilities have at the moment a proposal of nearly $1 billion of investments into charging infrastructure. And there's a question of where one should best locate those chargers. In a traditional environment with very little solar, one may want to incentivize people to charge their EVs, electric vehicles, at home over the course of the night, as electricity prices used to be the lowest then. But in a high solar future, we may instead want to focus on charging during the middle of the day when electricity prices are low in a high solar future. And so where to locate those at a residential location or maybe in front of stores or at offices and commercial sites is one of those questions where you have a long-lasting investment where you kind of need to make your mind up now and take into account different possible futures. Advanced commodity production processes may be able to utilize spells of low electricity prices. Demand response services may need to be redesigned slightly so that load is not actually just shed, but could also potentially increase at times when we have excess electricity generation. Retail rate design is another area that may deserve a little bit more focus in the future and consideration of VRE levels. In general, we'll talk here only about wholesale electricity price effects, and the typical end-use customer is not very exposed to those wholesale electricity prices. But especially in regions where we only have flat electricity tariffs without any kind of price variation during the course of the day or the year. However, again, an example from California, time-of-use pricing will become the default by the year 2019. There's a question then on how you may choose those time-of-use periods. We've seen a debate already of pushing really high-cost periods into the early evening or late afternoon when solar is not as active anymore. But also critical peak pricing programs may need to be changed slightly. Having more call options on critical peak events, or maybe even real-time pricing as it is already offered in some regions in Texas. So the relative cost benefits of these different retail range designs may change quite a bit depending on whether you have very little wind and solar or more wind within a system. On the supply side, there are questions about whether nuclear revenue sufficiency may change at higher renewable penetrations and whether or not those nuclear plants need incentives in some areas of the United States. That's very actively discussed, and so the actual level of incentives may change. And other questions are other opportunities to retrofit nuclear power plants to become a little bit more flexible, potentially participate in ancillary service markets, or maybe have just a seasonal operation. There's a general question about what to invest in a combined cycle gas turbine that is fairly fuel efficient, or a reciprocating engine that is not quite as fuel efficient but has much more flexibility and is thus able to ramp up and down more quickly. Similarly, energy storage and electrochemical storage batteries are widely discussed now. Higher VRE penetration levels may change the cost effectiveness and also the capability selection. So do I emphasize capacity, so the ability to discharge a lot of energy quickly, or really energy storage duration? Last, hydropower relicensing might be an area that is affected. So we have a lot of dams in the northwest that need to be relicensed, and higher levels of wind and solar may lead to different dispatch of those hydropower plants, and those alternate water flow regimes may in turn impact the hydropower relicensing. Last, those energy prices also have impacts on VRE assets themselves. There are some shifts in location potentially where some areas have resources, wind or solar resources, solar maybe not as much, more wind, that are better aligned with the new high price periods. And we observe that already along the Gulf Coast in Texas, for example. It might lead to some changes in the project design to maximize value instead of just energy production or just lowering the levelized cost of electricity. So for solar, that means, for example, a higher inverter loading ratio or a DC to AC ratio, or for fixed tilt installation, not just a southern orientation, but instead a southwestern or maybe even western orientation. For wind, that could mean larger rotors or taller towers. And in general, of course, for wind and solar, there's an opportunity to co-locate storage on site. May also change the investment decisions between solar and wind assets, depending on the penetration of those technologies. And overall, it could change the operations of wind and solar. Is there an opportunity to have something like a dispatchable wind and solar project that is actually curtailed for most of the time? Are there different contractual structures that emphasize capacity payments or energy payments in a different way? How do you allocate pricing risk between an owner and an off-taker of a PPA? For the rest of this presentation, we'll now focus really on these wholesale electricity price impacts. For more details on those kind of decisions here, please look at the appendix of the presentation or the report itself. So now the overall analytical framework that we use for our quantitative assessment, and I would like to highlight if you have any kind of questions throughout this presentation, please enter them in the Q&A box and we'll try to turn to them at the end of this presentation. So overall, we looked at the year 2030, and we looked at 4 different regions: in the Southwestern Power Pool in the Midwest, NYSERDA in New York, CAISO in California, and ERCOT in Texas. We contrasted, in general, 4 different future scenarios. One that froze wind and solar shares at the 2016 penetration levels, and we described that as a low VRE future. In some areas, that's actually not quite as low. California has already 14% solar, for example, but nevertheless, that's kind of our business as usual case. And it's important to recognize that we don't project that in the year 2030 there's no more wind or solar growth from today. In fact, since 2016 already quite a bit of wind and solar has been added, but it really is intended to be used as a straw man or a kind of a lower bookend of a range of future possibilities. On the other end, we then have a high VRA future, in fact 3, one that has a lot of solar, one that has a lot of wind, and one that is balanced between the 2 resources. In the high wind and high solar case, we have 30% wind and solar, and at least 10% of the other resources. So we wanted to make sure to not go below the 2016 penetration level. So for example, in ERCOT and SPP, we'll have more than 10% wind in the high solar case, and in California, we'll have more than 10% solar in the high wind case. We've partnered with a consulting company, LCG Consulting, from the Bay Area, and utilized, on the one hand, a capacity expansion model that was used to establish the portfolio of generators for the year 2030. And we chose among several conventional options, and it was based on a social cost minimization. And so as a result, for the year 2030, we have a generation portfolio that is actually quite different already from the one that we see currently in the market. Some coal units, for example, retire, and small gas units are added. So our low VRE future is not necessarily just the same as what we see currently in the market. Also important here, we only use that capacity expansion model to establish the non-VRE parts. Wind and solar levels were established exogenously, so we just did a what-if kind of scenario analysis. In a second step, we then used a market simulation model called U-Plan that co-optimizes hourly energy and ancillary service prices, and also allowed us to extract capacity prices and CO2 emissions. Overall, emission costs and CO2 emissions are quite important because they can drive clearing prices quite a bit. We relied here on projections of permit prices by planning entities for CAISO and NYSO, so $50 and about $25 per ton in those 2 regions. For SPP and ERCOT, we did not assume any kind of carbon pricing environment. Load levels also are important. We rely here on forecasts by planning entities, and fuel prices are also very important because they affect the generator investment choices and the merit order dispatch. We relied here on EIA projections that were then slightly adjusted for regions. Overall, the market design is assumed to be roughly similar to the one that we see today in the markets, which, for example, means that renewables themselves cannot provide ancillary services, which in turn has important effects on those ancillary service prices, as we'll see later. We also assume limited leakage of wind and solar electricity into neighboring regions by assuming that VRE penetration levels in the neighboring regions are at the same levels, because otherwise you could have much more imports and exports, which then actually would mitigate some of the price effects. Another big assumption is that we only really do a zonal level forecast, and do not go into large price differences between one price node and another. And we actually assume that transmission within a zone is increased up to a level that ensures that VRE curtailment is limited to only 3%. This has important effects on local pricing regimes, and it's just a big assumption that we want to be upfront about. Last, I really want to emphasize that the intent of this wholesale market price series is really to assess the marginal value of different decisions and not the average value. There's an important distinction here. You can really dive deep into the details if you want to by looking at the data yourself that is posted on our website. So just again, very brief highlight here of our 4 regions. I just really want to draw your attention to the fact that SPP and ERCOT don't really have any strong mandates for increasing VRE penetration into the future, but they do have a lot of wind, especially wind deployed already at the moment. At least for the moment, the market environment seems favorable for additional wind and solar, particularly new solar investments now as well. So that's why we picked those 2 regions. And then NYSO and CAISO, or New York and California, actually have quite strong and ambitious regulatory commitments to increase wind and solar in the future. California has already a lot of variable renewables, whereas New York at the moment still has very little. With that, I would like to now really switch to the electricity price findings themselves. I'll only glance very briefly in the interest of time about overcapacity and energy portfolios. What I want to highlight here briefly is that firm capacity actually is just reduced by a little once we introduce wind and solar, because the capacity credit, the ability of wind and solar to meet peak demand hours actually decreases for new units, new wind and solar units at increasing penetration levels. So capacity credit is about 10 to 24% for new wind and 8 to 63% for new solar. And this overall then leads to an overall growth in total installed capacity. Nevertheless, some firm capacity is reduced by about 4 to 16%. California, we have a little bit of an increase actually in firm capacity because some imports into California from the Western Interconnect are offset by local generation. On the generation side, the effects of VRE is much more clear. We see here that VRE generation really replaces nearly on a 1-to-1 ratio non-VRE generation, so particularly coal and natural gas generation. Overall, VRE curtailment is what we found is about 3 to 8%, and again, this is a little lower than some of the other studies that looked at such penetration levels, in part because of our transmission assumptions. In some areas, such as, for example, NYSO, fossil fuel generation is really reduced dramatically, up to 50%. This, in turn, then has implications on carbon emissions and carbon emission profiles, some marginal carbon emission profiles. Overall, we see that the number of hours that have marginal carbon emissions of just 0 pounds per megawatt hour increases across most regions quite a bit with increased VRE penetration, and also the diurnal price profile changes. For example, in SPP, traditionally in a low VRE environment, you have really high marginal carbon emissions of over 2,000 pounds per megawatt hour in the middle of the day, but in a high solar future, that really goes down to just 250 pounds per megawatt hour. So if a regulator or decision maker is trying to minimize marginal carbon emissions, the kind of investments and the timing of those optimal investments may change quite a bit. Now let's turn really to electricity prices. We see that we have an overall decrease in annual average electricity prices at increasing VRE penetration levels that is depicted on the graph on the left. You may wonder, wow, $60 per megawatt hour in California as average prices, that is quite high. That is true. It's much higher than what we have today in the market. It's in part driven by the higher carbon permit costs that we assume for the year 2030. But overall, prices decline with increasing VRE penetration levels by about $5 to $16 per megawatt hour. This finding roughly falls into the range that is established in the literature that is shown here on the right side. At the end of 2017, our group published a long report and literature review about VRE price effects, empirical ones, and what the literature kind of shows. That is available on our homepage. If you're interested in that, please go to our homepage and look at this report. In addition to those average price effects, a different way, I guess, to look at that maybe is to actually account for what is the price effect, the average electricity price effect of each additional VRE penetration percentage. And if we account for that, for the different starting points of VRE penetrations, we find a price effect of about 20 to 90 cents a megawatt hour for each additional percentage point of VRE penetration, depending on whether it's wind and solar and what kind of resource we have. And that again falls roughly into the established range of the literature. Now you may ask, why are average pricing effects important? Well, they are important to the extent that other generators, for example, cannot really ramp up or down their output and they are very exposed to average prices, such as, for example, a nuclear plant, or a generator that is just very exposed to have to generate at hours when wind and solar itself is generating, such as wind and solar itself. Now, we found decreasing average prices. In addition, there's a change in the distribution of prices. One way of looking at that is energy price duration curves that I described here on the left side. In some regions, the shape of these energy price duration curves is pretty constant, pretty similar. In New York, for example, it just kind of goes down but maintains the shape, whereas in other regions, such as ERCOT, for example, the shape changes quite dramatically, and we have this enormous cliff, especially in the high solar scenario, that leads to very low-priced hours. So on the right side, we look at those low-priced hours in particular and see that in the Texas high solar case, we really see nearly 20% of all hours with prices under $5 per megawatt hour. That can be explained to some extent by the limited ability of Texas to exchange electricity with its neighboring regions, given that it's its own interconnection. So we found decreasing average prices, an increase in low-priced hours, and we also found a change in the diurnal price profiles. On the left side, we have the annual average diurnal price profiles, and you really see this duck curve showing up in the high solar cases in most of the regions. But a high VRE future may not necessarily mean a duck curve in all regions, especially if we have a lot of wind. Then the price profile may be different. So, for example, if you look at the wind line, the blue line in ERCOT, prices are much more even there over the course of the day. It's also important to note here that the price peaks usually remain in the evening, so decreasing consumption there seems to be profitable or economically attractive. Last one note of caution here, these annual averages do not capture the full picture. We have quite a bit of seasonal variations in those diurnal profiles. For example, in the morning in the wind scenario in CAISO, we see stronger price reductions in the spring, but more limited in the fall and the winter. Similarly, afternoon solar price effects in New York, much more pronounced in the spring and summer, less so in the winter, which makes sense when solar is not generating as much in the winter. And another really strong example is in ERCOT. We have a couple of very high-priced hours over the summer that lead to an average price increase of nearly $180 per megawatt hour for the summer months, but only $5 per megawatt hour in the winter. So, in addition to those changes in the diurnal price profiles, one thing that we found as well was an increase in price variability or volatility. On the right side, we capture this by the so-called coefficient of variation, which is basically just the standard deviation of prices normalized by the mean energy price. That's good to facilitate cross-regional comparisons. We find that the solar cases are really the ones that have the most price variation, to some extent just because prices go low during the middle of the day and high at the end of the day when solar is not generating anymore. Now that is not necessarily a really tough thing because we can predict quite well when the sun is shining or sun sets and rises. What may be more challenging is actually price volatility. So after accounting for variability of diurnal profiles and seasonal shifts and the dynamics between weekdays and weekends, we actually find the highest share of irregular prices in the wind scenarios. One example of that, if you look here on the left side of the graph in California spring, we see this price collar of the 5th and 95th percentile, and in the low VRE scenario, that is quite low, quite narrow price distribution. Whereas in the high wind scenario, this price collar really grows a lot, and there may be some hours within the spring season at the same wind penetration, overall wind capacity penetrations, where you have on some days prices of $0 per megawatt hour, so free electricity, and then at other days up to $60 a megawatt hour. So a lot more irregularity and variability in prices. Now I'd like to briefly touch on ancillary service markets themselves. Overall, the ancillary service market is much smaller than the energy market, so much fewer resources can participate in this market and earn in that market. But overall, we see a strong increase in ancillary service prices. So those different products, regulation up and down, are meant to account for forecast hours of load or wind and solar generation levels, and then spin and non-spin resources thought to make up for short-term shutdowns of some generator plants. And so overall, the prices for these kind of services increase, in part because the demand for those services or products increases a little bit with VRE penetration, so about 1 to 1.5% of hourly VRE generation is how we increase the regulation requirements in line with current rules of those markets. And the price increase can, to some extent, be explained by very high, by a few hours with very high costs, up to $200 a megawatt hour. And the reason for that is that the opportunity cost for some generators that would otherwise not be operating in a market that has a lot of wind and solar anymore because there's no need for them, is really just driven by the ancillary service market themselves. And so the opportunity costs are very high, which means that they bid very high prices into those markets. And that then leads to high clearing prices. It's also important to note here, again, that wind and solar themselves were not able to offer those services into the market, or not eligible of offering those services into the market. There are a couple of reports by NREL that actually shows the technical capabilities of wind and solar to do so, but current market rules don't really allow for that, and so neither did we in this modeling exercise. Also, we did not allow for significant investments into new batteries beyond the battery mandate, for example, in California, which would be able to address and mitigate some of these price increases. Brief mentioning of capacity prices. So what we call capacity prices here is really the net revenue shortfall of some generators that cannot be completely made whole in the energy and ancillary service market themselves or alone. And the reason for that is that we in general have reserve requirements where we need to have more capacity in a market than just typical peak load levels, and that then does not necessarily allow all the generators to recover all of their costs. And in some markets we have organized capacity markets, in some others, such as ERCOT, we don't, but we've kind of have a uniform methodology of the price at getting these prices here and showing them here. So in general, in most regions, the capacity prices rise with increasing VRE penetration. The only exception here is CAISO. Some of these prices are a little sensitive to the assumptions of what the last kind of least efficient unit still is that is around in those markets, and if that particular unit would retire, then these capacity prices can change quite a bit. What may be more important is the actual probability of when those peak net load hours actually occur. With increasing VRE and especially solar penetrations, we see that those hours are increasingly shifted into the early evening. So any kind of demand response programs, for example, or general energy efficiency programs that would be able to address those peak net load hours, they may focus their attention increasingly into the evening. And another effect is that the top 100 net load hours actually are now spread over more days. For example, in ERCOT, the top 100 net load hours were concentrated in 22 days in the low VRE scenario, but were increasing to be spread over up to 45 days in the high VRE scenario. And so that has implications, for example, on critical peak pricing programs, your call options there to increase them. And so not just larger amount of days, but also broader range in months, not just in July, but from really, those occurred now from June till September. So with that, I'd like to conclude this presentation with a brief discussion of our findings and an outlook. We found that VRE additions enable a modest reduction of firm capacity and a strong reduction in non-VRE generation. We found that overall the growth of VRE can decrease average wholesale electricity prices by about $5 to $16 per megawatt hour. We find that increasing wind and solar shares change the times of when electricity is cheap or expensive and the regularity or predictability of those price patterns, particularly growth of low-priced periods, some changing diurnal patterns, especially in the high solar cases, and an increase in irregularity in prices, especially in the high wind cases. We found that the lowering or reduction in average prices will likely increase the relative importance of capacity and ancillary service markets and prices there. But it's important to note that the overall magnitude of these price shifts and the importance depends strongly on whether or not other people now respond to these changing prices. For example, if people may see those wholesale electricity prices, end-use customers see those much more and change their demand profiles. And so we have different aggregate load shapes, or whether DR participation is really able to address some of those peak price hours, or what role storage will play. And in our capacity expansion model, we've only really relied on conventional options and have not fully included energy efficiency programs or DR programs or additional battery units to play a role. So this is kind of, to some extent, the worst case scenario that we are drawing here. Last, also, our results are quite sensitive to a range of assumptions. We've, as I mentioned before, not modeled nodal prices or any kind of really intra-regional congestion. We've limited the leakage of VRE price effects to neighboring regions by assuming high VRE penetration levels there as well. Any kind of deviations from our assumed fuel costs and emission costs can have important effects on the optimal selection of generators and our portfolio and marginal prices as a consequence of that. And at last, we only really focused on the singular year 2030, and we do not capture any kind of inter-annual variation, for example, dramatic cold spells or droughts, or just general resource variation of wind and solar resources from one year to another. And neither do we capture the longer-term evolution of the electric system beyond just the year 2030. So, of course, that's likely not going to be the end of wind and solar, depending on the policy environment and the value proposition for wind and solar. But we really just focused on the singular year. So overall, don't be too wed to the very precise dollars per megawatt hours that we found for each individual hour. Our real aim here was just to paint a broad picture and really have this as scoping analysis and highlight the general type of decisions that are sensitive to changing wholesale electricity prices, and just that people are a little bit more cognizant of those questions as they go about new long-lasting investments. In terms of the outlook, in the written report in particular, we highlight those kind of long-term electric sector decisions qualitatively a little bit more than we did during today's presentation. And during this year, we'll want to focus on a quantitative assessment of demand-side decision implications, and then the year after that on supply-side decisions implications. With that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and that you all have busy days, and we appreciate that you spend an hour with us. You can download the technical report, the slide set, and the data from our publication website. On our website, you can as well sign up for our emailing list if you want to stay in touch and receive notifications about new publications that we launch and find out about other renewable energy publications that we have on our website there. If you have any further questions that we are not able to address today during the Q&A session, please feel free to contact us afterwards, and we'd be happy to get in touch with you. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Andrew and ask whether there may be any kind of question. I saw that you were quite busy.
Yes, we do have a lot of questions, and we're down to the last 10 minutes here, so we'll try to move through these fairly rapidly. But one quick question that came in was just if you could provide some examples to clarify what was meant by advanced commodity production.
Yeah, so this is just the general question whether there are any kind of opportunities to really make use of short spells of low electricity prices. And in general, industries that could move into this space are those that have fairly high operational costs, for example, aluminum smelters or steel smelters, or maybe also paper manufacturing, so that are quite energy intensive and have high operational costs, where energy costs really make up a big part of their overall marginal production costs, and whether or not those processes may utilize electricity as an energy input and really make use of periods with very low electricity prices.
Okay, and then moving on to some of the scenarios, what was meant by 30% wind and solar? Is that on capacity basis or on an energy basis?
Yeah, this is on an energy basis prior to curtailment.
Okay. And then could you say something about where the non-VRE price projections came from in terms of the capital costs and fuel costs?
Yeah, we relied here on projections by the EIA, and the actual cost assumptions that we have are listed in the appendix of our report.
And then in terms of, this is a question on California scenarios as to whether or not we had assumed that there was broader integration with the Western grid in this analysis. And from my understanding, we modeled the entire WEC system, but there were transmission limitations between CAISO and WEC, and then there were some hurdle rates that were imposed commensurate with things, with carbon costs, and I think to reflect some of the friction between those. So I don't think it was a full Western integration, but we did include WEC in that modeling. Then on the capacity expansion setup, there were quite a few questions about whether or not resources like storage and DR were included in the Gen X model, and if storage was added for any renewable energy integration.
Yeah, and I had addressed that a little bit already during the presentation. We did not very actively look at DR energy efficiency or batteries. For California, we've included all the batteries that are currently mandated under the 1.3 gigawatts rule for new storage. But other than that, we have not fully had those as options within the capacity expansion model. And that does not mean that we don't believe that DR energy efficiency or batteries could play an important role. We just wanted to kind of draw a picture of a future that does not rely heavily on those resources, and what the extreme kind of price effects would be, given that DR storage, etc., would likely have a mitigation effect on those prices. And so, again, the futures that we've modeled here are not meant to be precise forecasts of what the future will look like. It is just a scenario analysis. What would happen if you do not take any kind of mitigatory steps to address those issues?
Okay. And there were quite a number of questions on ancillary services. One of them was, did we model renewable energy being allowed to provide ancillary services? And there was an example of somebody seeing a presentation from PJM saying that currently wind and solar aren't allowed to provide synchronous reserves in those areas, and what would be the value if renewable energy could provide reserves?
Yeah, we've not allowed wind and solar to offer those, even though I think technically in many cases they can or could if that was demanded. We have looked a little bit at the value proposition of wind and solar, and found quite a bit of value decline of the energy that is generated by wind and solar. We didn't include that yet here in this presentation, as it really will be the focus of our year 3 efforts, where we look at supply side asset implications. But we found a general decrease there in the energy and capacity value of of wind and solar at higher penetration levels. And we found that if wind and solar would be able to pitch in about 20% of their energy in those hours where ancillary service prices are higher than energy prices, but that would actually lead to quite a bit of a revenue increase. So that could mitigate some of the value decline. Of course, in general, those ancillary service prices will decrease once wind and solar would really be able to pitch in there. So unfortunately, that is probably not going to be the full rescue solution there.
Yeah, and I guess a follow-on question was do these higher ancillary service prices potentially incentivize other resources to provide these same grid services other than just renewable energy?
Yeah, I think that is exactly the case. Demand response programs could play a much more active role there, or batteries, for example, as well.
And then there was a question as to whether or not VRE could be curtailed at no cost, and then also related to that, what did we assume about the PTC and ITC, and then were there any effects that we saw here related to negative prices?
Yeah, great questions. We did not assume the ITC to really play a role. It didn't really matter too much in general because we did not make our VRE penetration contingent on profitability of wind and solar. So again, kind of the way that we had set this up was we did this what-if scenario, assuming that we have a lot of wind and solar, maybe because of some kind of renewable portfolio standard or clean energy standard, what would be the consequences for other market participants. So the actual profitability and capital costs of wind and solar were not directly included in this model. As such, the ITC would not really play a role by the year 2030. It is very likely to be phased out anyway. In terms of the production tax credit for wind, we assumed that would also be phased out and that it is not available for any turbines anymore that would be around in the year 2030. As such, we did not assume that there are significant incentives for wind and solar to really then bid negative prices into the market. And we assumed basically that at $0 per megawatt hour or slightly negative prices, wind and solar would actually curtail their energy output completely, or up at least until the levels that prices rise again to $0 per megawatt hour. So this may not be 100% realistic, as some renewable energy credits may incentivize wind and solar to actually pitch in at negative prices, or some other green electricity standards from corporate procurers, or any other kind of contractual structures that would incentivize wind and solar to actually continue to provide output. We assumed that for this particular study that they would then shut off their generation and prices would not in fact go negative. That is very different from how markets operate at the moment, where we do see quite often negative electricity prices.
And then one final question that's related to that is what effect the sort of cap and trade type programs have on some of these results. So this would be the RGGI program and then also California's program.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure that we've really looked too deeply into that yet. We have included the carbon costs for New York and so the RGGI program there and the cap and trade program in California, and assumed about $25 per ton for New York and $50 or $54 in California. But there are quite a few different assumptions about what those carbon costs are going to be. We relied, for example, in California on predictions by the CEC, the California Energy Commission. During the current IRP process, there are quite a variety of assumptions about carbon costs. Some will go much higher. And so that would mean that if you would have still a generator that has carbon-intensive generation and a lot of carbon emissions, that the marginal costs of providing that electricity from that generator would rise, and so that unit is the marginal unit. Prices would rise within those hours. So that would mean, in particular, that during times of low VRE generation, prices would likely rise to higher levels than what we've modeled here. And it may overall change a little bit the overall portfolio, where some more carbon-intensive coal units, for example, would retire to a larger extent than what we've modeled here. in comparison to low carbon pricing futures.
Okay, and we want to respect everybody's time, so we're at the top of the hour. We apologize for not getting to all of the questions, but we will follow up with you individually. And we thank you all again for joining and look forward to talking with you again in the future. Take care.